Jonathan Roumie was about to hear 5 words from Joel Osteen's son that would expose the darkest secret of the prosperity gospel empire, but what happened next would change both their lives forever. The younger Osteen had just made a confession so devastating that if it went public, it could collapse a billion-dollar ministry built over 3 generations. They were alone in a backstage room at Lakewood Church. No cameras, no producers, just 2 men and a truth that had been buried for decades. Jonathan Osteen's hands were trembling as he looked at the man who played Jesus on screen and said the words that would haunt him. What were those 5 words that made Jonathan Roumie's blood run cold? What secret had the Osteen family been hiding that even their closest circle didn't know? This is the story of the most dangerous conversation in modern Christianity, the moment when inherited wealth collided with authentic faith, and it all started when Jonathan Osteen made a decision that would cost him everything he had ever known. But the real question is, why did Jonathan Roumie walk into that megachurch on that specific Sunday morning when he wasn't even invited? 3 weeks earlier, Jonathan Roumie was sitting in a quiet coffee shop in Dallas, scrolling through messages from viewers of The Chosen when he received a text from an unknown number that would change everything. The message was brief but desperate. "You don't know me, but I need to talk to someone who actually knows Jesus. I'm drowning in a life everyone thinks is blessed. Please help me." The number had a Houston area code. Jonathan almost ignored it, another person seeking counsel in his DMs, but something in his spirit wouldn't let him delete it. He responded with a simple question. "Who are you?" The reply came 3 hours later, after Jonathan had already forgotten about the exchange. "I'm Joel Osteen's son, and I think everything I've been taught about God might be a lie." Jonathan stared at his phone screen, reading the words again and again. Joel Osteen's son, the heir to America's largest church, the next generation of the prosperity gospel dynasty, was reaching out to an actor for spiritual help. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a man raised in a 16,000-seat megachurch, surrounded by wealth and influence, and he was texting a stranger because he had no one else he could trust with his doubts. Jonathan's small apartment in Los Angeles suddenly felt very far from the gilded world of Lakewood Church. His walls were bare except for a simple wooden cross his grandmother had given him before she passed, whispering in broken English that real faith costs everything but gives more than gold ever could. On his kitchen table sat stacks of theology books, their pages worn and marked with notes from years of studying not for a role, but for his own hungry soul. Next to them were letters, hundreds of them, from people who had written to thank him for showing them a Jesus they had never seen in their own churches, a Jesus who loved the broken more than the successful, who called the weary rather than the wealthy. Jonathan looked at the text again. This wasn't a publicity opportunity. This wasn't a platform. This was a soul in crisis, and Jonathan knew what it felt like to question everything you'd been taught to believe. He had walked that painful road himself years ago when he realized that the Jesus of Scripture looked nothing like the Jesus being sold in celebrity Christianity. He typed his response carefully. "I'll meet you, but not at your church. And you have to come alone." The reply was almost instant. "Thank you. I'll be alone. I've been alone for a long time." Jonathan closed his phone and knelt beside his bed, praying for wisdom he didn't possess and courage he didn't feel. He thought about Jesus meeting the rich young ruler, how the young man walked away sad because he had great wealth. He wondered if this meeting would end the same way, with a man choosing comfort over truth. But he also remembered the tax collector who climbed a tree just to see Jesus, and how that encounter changed everything. Jonathan made peace with the fact that this meeting might accomplish nothing, that Jonathan Osteen might simply be curious rather than serious, that walking into this situation could damage his own reputation if it went sideways. But some conversations are worth having even when the outcome is uncertain, because sometimes God uses unlikely people in unlikely moments to crack open the prisons we build for ourselves. He booked a flight to Houston, told no one where he was going, and prepared to meet a man who had everything the world valued and nothing his soul needed. When Jonathan Roumie arrived at the small diner on the outskirts of Houston 3 days later, he almost didn't recognize the man sitting in the back corner booth. Jonathan Osteen looked nothing like the polished, confident figure Jonathan had seen in promotional videos for Lakewood Church. The designer suit was replaced with a plain hoodie and jeans. The perfectly styled hair was hidden under a baseball cap pulled low. But it was the eyes that told the real story, hollow and exhausted, the eyes of someone who hadn't slept well in months, maybe years. Jonathan slid into the booth across from him and waited. He had learned that desperate people don't need small talk, they need silence safe enough to fill with truth. Jonathan Osteen stared at his untouched coffee for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. I chose this place because nobody from our church would ever come here. Too ordinary. We teach people that God wants them in 5-star restaurants, not diners with cracked vinyl booths. His voice carried a bitterness that seemed to surprise even himself. Jonathan Roumie said nothing, just listened as the younger Osteen continued. Do you know what it's like to preach abundance to people who can barely afford gas to get to church? To tell them their poverty is a sign of weak faith while you're wearing a watch that costs more than their annual salary. The words tumbled out now, faster, like a dam breaking. I've been doing this since I was 16. Youth pastor, associate minister, heir apparent. Everyone thinks I'm blessed. Everyone thinks I have it all figured out. But the truth is, I don't know if I've ever actually met Jesus. Not the real one. Just the profitable version my family sells. Jonathan Roumie leaned forward slightly. So why reach out to me? Why now? Jonathan Osteen pulled off his cap and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. Because I watched The Chosen. I watched you portray Jesus and something broke inside me. The Jesus you show, he's poor. He's tired. He touches lepers. He eats with people my church would never let through the front door. And I realized I've never heard my father preach about that Jesus. Not once. We preach about the Jesus who makes you successful, who blesses you financially, who wants you comfortable. But we never preach about the Jesus who said to sell everything and follow him. Tears formed in the corners of his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away, looking around to make sure no one had noticed. 3 months ago, I was in my father's office after service. We just had our biggest attendance week ever. The offering was record-breaking. Dad was celebrating. And I asked him a question I'd never had the courage to ask before. I said, Dad, if Jesus appeared right now and told us to give away everything and minister to the poor, would you do it? Do you know what he said? Jonathan Roumie shook his head slowly. He laughed. He actually laughed and said, Son, Jesus gave us this platform so we could reach millions. You don't reach millions from a soup kitchen. You reach them from a stadium. And I realized in that moment that we've built an empire on a version of Jesus that lets us keep our empire. We've created a gospel where following God looks exactly like the American dream because that's what sells books and fills seats. Jonathan Osteen's voice dropped to barely a whisper. But here's what terrifies me. What if we're wrong? What if everything my grandfather started, everything my father built, everything I'm supposed to inherit, what if it's all just a beautiful, expensive lie? What if we've spent 50 years leading people away from Jesus while using his name? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Jonathan Roumie recognized this moment. This was the crossroads where comfortable faith dies and real faith begins, but the road from here required a death most people aren't willing to die. Jonathan, Roumie said softly, can I ask you something? When was the last time you read the Gospels without trying to make them fit your father's theology? The younger Osteen's face crumpled. I can't remember. Maybe never. I've always read them through the lens of what I was taught they meant, not what they actually say. He looked up, and his eyes held a desperate hope mixed with terror. Will you help me? Will you show me how to find the real Jesus, even if it costs me everything I've been raised to value? Jonathan Roumie felt the weight of that request settle on his shoulders. This wasn't about winning a debate or exposing false teaching. This was about a human soul trapped in a golden cage, reaching through the bars for freedom. I'll help you, Jonathan said. But you need to understand something. The Jesus of the Gospels doesn't add to your life. He asks for your life. And once you truly see him, you can't unsee him. You can't go back to the comfortable version. Jonathan Osteen nodded, and for the first time since they'd met, a small, genuine smile crossed his face. Good. Because I'm tired of comfortable. I want real, even if real is hard. What Jonathan Roumie didn't know was that their private meeting in that diner wouldn't stay private for long. 2 weeks after their first conversation, Jonathan Osteen did something that would send shockwaves through the entire Prosperity Gospel network. He called his father and asked for permission to host a public dialogue at Lakewood Church between himself and Jonathan Roumie about the nature of biblical prosperity. Joel Osteen, always seeing an opportunity for content and publicity, agreed immediately, assuming his son wanted to use the famous actor to bring credibility to their message. He had no idea his son was about to dismantle everything publicly. The announcement went viral within hours. Jonathan Roumie, the man who portrayed Jesus in the most watched faith series in history, would be sitting down with Joel Osteen's son at America's largest church for a conversation about wealth, faith, and what Jesus actually taught. Prosperity Gospel leaders saw it as a victory, a chance to showcase their theology on a massive platform. Critics saw it as either a trap or a surrender, wondering why Roumie would legitimize Lakewood with his presence. But neither side understood what was really happening. This wasn't a debate. This was a son preparing to tell the truth in his father's house, consequences be damned. The night before the event, Jonathan Osteen sent Roumie a text message that revealed the weight of what was coming. Tomorrow I'm going to say things I can never take back. Things that will hurt my family. Things that might end my ministry. But I can't keep lying. I've spent the last 2 weeks reading the Gospels like you told me to, without trying to make them say what I want. And Jonathan, I can't find our theology anywhere in there. All I find is a Jesus who calls people away from wealth, not toward it. I'm terrified, but I'm ready. Pray for me. Pray my father hears me with his heart, not his business sense. When Jonathan Roumie walked onto the stage at Lakewood Church the next evening, he was struck by the overwhelming production value of everything. Massive screens displayed graphics with both their faces. Professional lighting created an atmosphere more suitable for a concert than a conversation about faith. The seats were filled with over 12,000 people, most of them expecting an encouraging message about God's blessings and financial breakthrough. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation, but it was the wrong kind of anticipation. They had come expecting inspiration. They were about to get confrontation. Joel Osteen himself opened the evening with his trademark smile and encouraging words. Tonight we're going to have a powerful conversation about God's goodness and his desire to bless his children. I'm so proud of my son Jonathan for bringing us this opportunity, and so grateful to Jonathan Roumie for being here to share his perspective. The audience applauded enthusiastically. Victoria Osteen sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Ministry staff members stood along the walls, ready to capture content for social media. Everything was perfectly choreographed for what they thought would be a friendly dialogue that reinforced their message. They had no idea they were about to witness a demolition. Jonathan Osteen took the stage, and even before he spoke, Roumie could see the change in him. 2 weeks of reading scripture without the filter of prosperity theology had done something visible to his face. The polished veneer was gone, replaced by something raw and real. When he sat down across from Roumie, his hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. The moderator, a staff pastor at Lakewood, smiled broadly and began with what he thought was a softball question. Jonathan Osteen, you've grown up in this amazing ministry, seeing God's favor and blessing firsthand. How has that shaped your understanding of what God wants for his children? The younger Osteen took a deep breath, looked at his father in the front row, and then spoke words that made the entire room go silent. Actually, I need to start by saying something difficult. I've been shaped by an understanding of God that I'm no longer sure is biblical. And tonight, I want to have an honest conversation about that, even though it's going to be uncomfortable. The moderator's smile faltered. Joel Osteen's expression shifted from pride to concern. The audience sensed something unexpected was happening, and the room's energy changed from celebration to tension. Jonathan Roumie leaned forward, silently communicating support, knowing that what came next would require more courage than most people possess in a lifetime. For my entire life, Jonathan Osteen continued, his voice growing stronger, I've been taught that God's primary desire is to make his children wealthy, healthy, and successful. I've preached it. I've believed it. I've built my entire identity around it. But 2 weeks ago, I did something I should have done years ago. I read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, cover to cover, with one simple question in mind. Does Jesus actually teach what we preach here? The silence in the room was deafening. And the answer I found terrified me. Because everywhere I looked, Jesus was saying the opposite of what I've been taught. He told a wealthy man to sell everything. He said it's nearly impossible for the rich to enter heaven. He warned that you cannot serve both God and money. He praised the poor widow who gave her last coins. He had nowhere to lay his own head. And I had to face a devastating truth. Either Jesus was wrong or we are. The moderator tried to interrupt, to steer the conversation back to safer territory, but Jonathan Osteen held up his hand. Please, let me finish. I asked Jonathan Roumie to come here tonight not to validate our theology, but to help me, and maybe help all of us, figure out if we've been following Jesus or following a comfortable version of Christianity that lets us keep our wealth and call it blessing. He turned to look directly at Roumie, and his next words cut through every pretense in that stadium. So here's my question, and I need you to answer it honestly, no matter who it offends. If Jesus walked into this building right now, into this 16,000-seat former basketball arena with its bookstore full of products and its message of financial blessing, would he celebrate what we've built? Or would he overturn tables like he did in the temple? Jonathan Roumie felt 12,000 pairs of eyes on him, waiting for his answer to a question that could end careers and shatter empires. He looked at Joel Osteen in the front row, then at Jonathan Osteen sitting across from him, and then he did something no one expected. He stood up, walked over to the younger Osteen, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Before I answer that question, I need to tell you all something about myself that most people don't know. Something I've never shared publicly because it's painful and humbling. But I think it matters tonight. The room leaned in. Even Joel Osteen sat forward in his seat, curious despite his visible discomfort. 10 years ago, before The Chosen, before anyone knew my name, I was broke. Not poor. Broke. I was a struggling actor in Los Angeles working 3 jobs to pay rent on a tiny apartment with plumbing that barely worked. I was angry at God because I had talent, I had faith, I had prayed all the prayers, but nothing was working. And then one Sunday, desperate for hope, I walked into a church that looked a lot like this one. Jonathan's voice softened, carrying pain that still felt fresh. The pastor that day preached about seed faith. He said if I would sow a financial seed, God would multiply it back to me 100-fold. He said my poverty was a sign that I hadn't activated my faith with my finances. And I was so desperate, so tired of struggling, that I believed him. I went home and wrote a check for $500, money I needed for rent, and I sent it to that ministry. Do you know what happened? The silence was absolute. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I got evicted 2 weeks later. I slept in my car for a month. I ate 1 meal a day. And I was furious at God because I had done what they told me to do. I had sown my seed, and instead of a harvest, I got homelessness. I almost walked away from faith entirely because I thought God had lied to me. But the truth was, God hadn't lied. That pastor had lied. He had sold me a version of faith that treats God like a cosmic vending machine. You put money in, you get blessings out. And when it didn't work, I blamed God instead of blaming the theology. Jonathan Roumie turned to face the audience fully now, his voice rising with intensity. But here's what happened next that changed everything. One night, sleeping in my car behind a grocery store, I was reading the Gospel of Matthew by flashlight because I had nothing else to do. And I came to the part where Jesus is in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. And Satan offers him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory if Jesus will just bow down and worship him. And suddenly I saw it. I saw what the prosperity gospel really is. It's Satan's original temptation repackaged. It's the offer of comfort, wealth, success, and power in exchange for bending your faith to serve those things instead of serving God. Gasps rippled through the audience. Several people stood to leave, offended. But most stayed, frozen by the weight of what they were hearing. I'm not saying everyone who preaches prosperity is Satan. I'm saying the message itself comes from the same place as that wilderness temptation. It promises you can have Jesus and the kingdoms of this world. It tells you that following God leads to comfort instead of cross. And it's a lie that I almost died believing." Jonathan looked directly at Joel Osteen now, his voice filled with both challenge and compassion. "Pastor Osteen, with respect, your net worth is over $100 million. Your church brings in tens of millions annually. You live in a mansion worth multiple millions. And you preach that this is God's blessing on your faith. But I have to ask you the same question your son just asked me. If Jesus, who had no place to lay his head, who told his disciples to take nothing for their journey, who said blessed are the poor, if that Jesus walked in here tonight, would he affirm your lifestyle? Or would he weep?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Joel Osteen's face went through a rapid series of changes: shock, defensiveness, hurt, and finally something that looked almost like fear. He stood slowly, every eye in the building tracking his movement. Jonathan Roumie, I appreciate your testimony, but I think you're misunderstanding biblical prosperity. God doesn't want his children poor. He wants us to be the head and not the tail, to lend and not borrow, to be blessed so we can be a blessing." His voice had the practiced quality of someone who had given this defense 1,000 times. "This ministry has helped millions of people. We've given millions to charity. We've brought hope to the hopeless. You can't do that from a position of poverty." But before Roumie could respond, Jonathan Osteen stood up, and what he said next would become the moment everyone remembered. "Dad, stop. Just stop." His voice cracked with emotion. "I love you. I respect you. But I can't let you deflect this with talking points anymore. Jonathan Roumie just told us he was homeless because he believed what we preach. He lost everything because a church like ours told him God works like a slot machine. And instead of saying, 'That's horrible, that's not what we should be teaching,' you're defending the system that hurt him." Tears streamed down the younger Osteen's face now, and his voice rose with decades of suppressed truth. "Dad, when's the last time you sat with someone who was poor and didn't try to fix them? When's the last time you read Jesus' words about money and let them make you uncomfortable? When's the last time you considered that maybe, just maybe, our wealth isn't a sign of God's favor but a sign that we've compromised his message to keep our comfort?" The stadium erupted in chaos. Some people applauded. Others shouted in anger. Several ministers rushed toward the stage. But in the middle of it all, Joel Osteen stood frozen, staring at his son with an expression of complete devastation, because the one voice he couldn't dismiss, the one voice that cut through all his defenses, was the voice of his own child telling him the empire was built on sand. Security moved toward the stage, clearly unsure whether to stop the conversation or protect it. But Joel Osteen raised his hand, signaling everyone to stop. "Let him speak," he said quietly. "Let my son speak." The chaos settled into a tense, electric silence. Jonathan Osteen wiped his face, looking suddenly vulnerable despite being in his 30s. He turned to his father with an expression that held equal parts love and desperation. "Dad, I need to tell you something I discovered 2 months ago that I've been terrified to admit." He took a shaking breath. "I don't believe anymore. Not in what we preach. I don't believe God's primary concern is making us wealthy. I don't believe poverty is a sign of weak faith. And Dad, here's what breaks my heart." He paused, his voice barely a whisper that somehow carried through the entire stadium. "I don't think you believe it either." The words landed like a bomb. Joel Osteen's face went pale. Victoria gasped audibly. But the younger Osteen pressed forward. 3 years ago, remember when Mom got sick? Really sick? I came to your office one night and you were alone, weeping, begging God to spare her life. And I heard you say 5 words, Dad. 5 words that told me you knew the truth even if you couldn't admit it publicly. Joel Osteen's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles white. You said, I can't buy her healing. The younger Osteen's voice broke completely. And in that moment, alone when you thought no one could hear, you admitted what we never admit from this stage. That all our money, all our positive confession, all our seed faith, none of it could control God. You were just a terrified husband facing reality. You were broken and helpless, and Dad, that's when you were closest to the real Jesus you've ever been. Tears streamed down Joel Osteen's face, years of carefully maintained composure crumbling. I can't buy her healing. the younger Osteen repeated softly. 5 words that prove you know what we preach isn't the full truth. If you know it, why do we keep selling it to desperate people? Why do we keep telling them their breakthrough is one more offering away when you knew it wasn't true? Joel Osteen walked toward the stage, his perfect posture gone. When he reached his son, he stood there silent, and 12,000 people held their breath. "You're right," he finally said, his voice broken. In that moment I knew. All the sermons I'd preached, none of it could save the person I loved most. And I was angry at God for not working the way I'd told everyone he works. The confession sent shockwaves through the room. But I pushed it down, Joel continued. Admitting it would mean everything we built might be built on an incomplete gospel. And I couldn't face that. Jonathan Roumie stepped forward, his voice gentle. "Pastor Osteen, your son didn't bring me here to destroy you. He brought me here because he loves you enough to tell you the truth. The question is, what are you going to do now that you've admitted it?" The older Osteen looked at his son, then out at thousands of faces. "I don't know," he said simply, and the honesty in those 3 words was more powerful than any sermon he'd ever preached. "I don't know how to lead people into truth when I've spent decades leading them into comfort." Jonathan Osteen took his father's hand. "Then maybe we figure it out together. Maybe we start by telling people we got it wrong. Maybe we discover that being faithful is better than being famous." The father looked at his son, and something shifted. The defensiveness melted away, replaced by relief. "When your mother was sick and I prayed that desperate prayer, God didn't heal her because I had enough faith. He healed her because He's sovereign and will never understand His ways. And that terrified me, because it meant I couldn't control Him." He looked out at the audience, his voice strengthening with painful honesty. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I kept teaching a message I knew had cracks in it. I'm sorry I valued this platform more than truth. I'm sorry I let fear keep me from admitting that sometimes God's answer is no, and that doesn't mean your faith is weak." The stadium sat in stunned silence as they witnessed something almost unheard of, a leader admitting he'd been wrong. What happened in the 48 hours after that night at Lakewood Church would shake the entire prosperity gospel movement to its core. Joel Osteen didn't sleep that night. He sat in his home office, surrounded by decades of sermon notes, book manuscripts, and promotional materials for conferences that promised financial breakthrough. And one by one, he began boxing them up. Victoria found him at 3 in the morning, tears streaming down his face as he held a copy of his most famous book, the one that had sold millions of copies worldwide. "What are we going to do?" she asked quietly. Joel looked at his wife, the woman whose near-death experience had cracked open the truth he'd been avoiding. "We're going to tell the truth, even if it costs us everything." The announcement came on Sunday morning, just 6 days after the confrontation. Joel Osteen stood before his congregation, but this time there was no smile, no upbeat music, no carefully crafted message of encouragement. "I need to talk to you about something I should have addressed years ago," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "My son confronted me last week with a truth I've been running from. The message we've preached here, the prosperity gospel, the idea that faith produces predictable financial results, it's incomplete at best and harmful at worst. And I take full responsibility for that." The sanctuary, usually filled with amens and applause, sat in shocked silence. Effective immediately, we're making changes. We're ending all paid conferences and courses that promise financial breakthrough. We're restructuring our ministry finances to increase our giving to the poor from 3% to 50%. We're going to study the Gospels together, really study them, and let Jesus' actual words reshape how we understand faith, money, and blessing. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several families stood and walked out. Staff members looked at each other in panic, knowing these changes meant massive budget cuts and possibly lost jobs. But others, many others, began to weep with relief, finally given permission to admit they'd always struggled with the theology but felt too guilty to question it. Within 2 weeks, the story had exploded across every major media platform. Christian networks were divided. Some called it the greatest revival in modern church history, a powerful return to authentic gospel truth. Others called it a tragic collapse, a betrayal of everything the prosperity movement had built. Lakewood's attendance dropped by 40% in the first month. 7 staff pastors resigned, unwilling to abandon prosperity theology. Book deals were canceled. Speaking invitations dried up. The Osteens' personal wealth began to decline as they quietly started selling properties and redirecting funds to actual ministry rather than lifestyle maintenance. But something else began to happen. Letters started pouring in, not dozens but thousands, from people who had been hurt by prosperity gospel teaching. A single mother who had given her last $300 as seed faith and then couldn't feed her children. A cancer patient who had been told his lack of healing proved his faith was weak. A man who had declared bankruptcy after following a prosperity preacher's financial advice. "Thank you," they wrote. "Thank you for finally admitting what we've known all along. Thank you for choosing truth over empire." Jonathan Osteen stepped down from his position at Lakewood and took a job as a high school teacher, making $45,000 a year. He moved from his luxury apartment to a modest rental in a struggling neighborhood. And for the first time in his life, he began attending a small house church where nobody knew his last name and nobody cared about his pedigree. "I'm learning what it means to follow Jesus when it costs me something," he told Jonathan Roumie during one of their regular phone calls. "And it's terrifying and beautiful at the same time." 6 months after that night, a video began circulating online. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation on their phone, and despite Lakewood's initial attempts to keep it private, the footage went viral. Over 200 million people watched Joel and Jonathan Osteen's exchange, watched a father and son wrestle with inherited theology, watched the moment when comfort gave way to truth. The comment sections were filled with testimonies. "I left my prosperity gospel church after watching this. I've been afraid to admit I didn't believe anymore. This gave me courage. My pastor needs to see this." Today, 2 years after that confrontation, both Jonathans continue their work, but everything has changed. Jonathan Roumie still portrays Jesus in The Chosen, but now he speaks openly about the danger of prosperity gospel, using his platform to point people toward the Jesus who called them to surrender, not success. Jonathan Osteen teaches English literature at an inner-city high school, mentoring young people who will never make him famous or wealthy. And Joel Osteen still leads at Lakewood, but the message from that stage has been revolutionized. The stadium is no longer filled to capacity, but those who come are hungry for substance, not just encouragement. The transformation wasn't without casualties. The Osteen family lost hundreds of millions in revenue. Friendships with other prosperity preachers dissolved. The criticism from former allies was brutal and unrelenting. But they also gained something they'd never truly had before: peace that comes from alignment with truth rather than profit. "I used to measure success by attendance and bank accounts," Joel said in a recent interview. "Now I measure it by whether I'm teaching people to actually follow Jesus, even when following him is uncomfortable." The ripple effects continue to spread in ways no one anticipated. Over 300 churches have publicly renounced prosperity gospel teaching in the wake of that night, many of them citing the Osteens' courage as their inspiration. Seminary students study the confrontation as a case study in theological reformation. But more importantly, countless individuals who had been wounded by prosperity theology found healing in watching someone with everything to lose choose truth anyway. The message boards and comment sections tell the real story: ordinary people who finally felt permission to admit that faith isn't a formula and God isn't a vending machine. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from a woman in Ohio who wrote, "I watched the most successful prosperity preacher in America admit he was wrong. If Joel Osteen can humble himself and start over, maybe I can too. Maybe we all can." That statement captures why the story resonates so deeply. It's not about exposing false teaching or tearing down ministries. It's about the possibility of change, the hope that no one is too successful, too invested, or too far gone to encounter truth and let it reshape everything. If this story stirred something in your heart, maybe it's time to ask yourself the hard question. What comfortable theology have you built your faith on because it's easier than following Jesus into the uncomfortable places he calls us? What empire, large or small, might God be asking you to walk away from? The answer is both terrifying and liberating, but it starts with one simple step toward truth, even when truth costs you everything you thought you needed. If you believe authentic faith is worth more than comfortable religion, subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, what would you have said to Joel Osteen in that moment? What comfortable belief is God challenging you to rethink? Because sometimes the most powerful transformations begin not when we get all the answers, but when we finally admit we've been asking the wrong questions. The real Jesus is still calling people away from empires and into authentic relationship. The question is, are you willing to answer that call, even if it costs you everything the world says you should want? That's where real faith begins, in the surrender of everything we thought would save us, and the discovery that Jesus alone is enough.